Towards the end of our morning session, David Kaufman asked the question, what are the educational and policy implications of this conversation around the changing nature of American Jewry's relationship, the changing or maybe not changing relationship with Israel. And this afternoon's conversation around Israel education will hopefully get to that. So I would like to first introduce our panelists in the order in which they will be speaking. Each will speak for about 15 minutes. I will then ask a question or two, but we really want to engage you in conversation, so we will pretty quickly after their presentations open it up for a broader conversation. So to my far left is Dr. Bethany Horowitz, a social psychologist who is the research assistant professor of Jewish education here at NYU, working with the doctoral students in Jewish education. Bethany reminded me that she got her start early on in her academic career researching the Israel sort of American Jews engagement. It was around conflict
resolution and peace
conflict
in the region
in the Middle East. So Israel-Palestinian conflict resolution. So in some ways, this is coming full circle. She does a lot of work on Jewish identity development, particularly in emerging adults, but across the spectrum. Bethany's title of her paper is up above, so we will be hearing from that shortly. Following Bethany is Yona Shem-Tov, to my immediate left, who is the executive director of Encounter. Yona will be speaking as a practitioner. Encounter is an educational organization dedicated to transforming the American Jewish communal engagement with the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And she'll be speaking about her work there as an educational institution. And then in the middle is Dr. Shaul Kellner.
Center left.
Center left.
I'm on the right?
No, you're on my immediate left. I am definitely not on the far right. Make that clear. Shaul is the Associate Professor of Sociology and Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University, directs the program in Jewish Studies there, and is the author of Tours That Bind, Diaspora Pilgrimage, and Israeli Birthright Tourism. So that he will, and he's also done some research on Encounter alumni. So he will be doing a little bit of compare and contrast of results from educational output results from Birthright and from Encounter. So that's the order in which we'll go, and I will turn it over to Bethany.
Actually, Lisa, can I ask you to just?
I'll
tell you about slides because there's no. I'm going to. I'm very glad to be here with you. Can you all hear me? Is this a good? Yeah. Okay. So you can see the title of my talk, and I'll explain it in a moment. But we can certainly say that one of the most prominent concerns on the agenda of contemporary American Jewish education, and probably more broadly in the American Jewish community, is what has come to be called Israel education. Now, the term can be confusing. If you Google it, as I have done, trying to not to define it, but to find certain resources, you'll get a lot about the Israeli education system in Israel, and practically nothing about what we mean by Israel, what educators have come to mean by Israel education. And so the purpose of and I don't know how you all think about it, but the purpose of my talk today is to understand more about this term, use it as a linguistic clue, and to see how it's come to prominence and why in recent years. Now, I'm calling my talk Black and Blue, or Blue and White or Black and Blue. It's partly in honor of Yom HaAtzmaut later this week. And I'm using it to sort of flag that we've shifted from, and I'm sure Ted's talked about it this morning, although I missed him, advocacy and solidarity to more of a commitment and critique mode, because of the difficult political context that we live in and that has been around since certainly 2000. So I want to first talk about the history of teaching Israel education, or teaching Israel to American Jews. It's not a new enterprise. After all, there's always been Israel in Judaism and in Jewish civilization. Anybody who opens their prayer book or who says a bracha, there's always Israel in that. But if we then focus in a little more on the enterprise of teaching American Jews about Israel, educators have used different terms in different periods. So thank you. You've already gone there. Good. We have the Eretz Yisrael period. This is in the early decades of the 20th century in the Palestine, pre-state period. One of the most important figures in American Jewish education was Samson Benderly. He's actually born in Sfat, where my grandmother was born. And he came to America, and he became really, really important in setting up what we now know as sort of the Jewish Hebrew school, the Hebrew school, and the community support for that. But in this case, he was very interested in creating a connection of American Jewish learners to the land of Israel and to its Jewish community. And this also led to the teaching of Hebrew in the model of Ivrit be'Ivrit, the natural language model, natural method model. I think if you go to the next page, so this represents actually, I didn't have a picture. This is the Eretz Yisrael picture. This is just, I don't have actually a textbook from that time, but I thought this picture would represent it. Now, if you go back a second, no, go back. We're going to go to Zionist education. Okay, Lisa, keep going forward. So, since I was talking about Hebrew, let me start with, in terms of the Zionist education period, which began, I would say, Herzberg's book, which is certainly about Zionist thinking, came out in 1959. But with the establishment of the state, we'd have to say that Zionist education began. On the American scene, one place that it really played out was in Jewish summer camps, particularly those that focused on the teaching of Hebrew. I'm a product of Mossad, which was famous for its Hebrew teaching, and Ramah also undertook it, Habonim, Young Judea. The Zionist youth movements focused on developing a deep connection and identification with Israel. For what purpose, though? To make people ready to make Aliyah. It was really part of the ethos, and it was kind of an elite undertaking of the leaders of the youth movements. But in this time, aside from this part of teaching Israel to American Jews, the main enterprise in schools, in Jewish schools, whether in synagogue or in day school, was for synagogue schools preparing students for synagogue life. They had to be able to read the Siddur, or read the prayer book, or learn how to lead services. So it was that kind of thing. And in the day schools, they were oriented to text knowledge and competence, but mostly around Jewish text. So it wasn't as Israel was not conveyed through the schools so much as through the air. And through the families and the ethnic culture that surrounded these schools. Let's move on to the teaching of Israel, which emerged in the 80s. The Likud, the sort of shift in, there were a lot of things going on, and I'm not going to rehearse them all, but you have a generation that didn't know 1948 and that was even later than 67. And by that time, please, I'm sorry. No, go forward. You're right. Teaching Israel. In the 1980s, and certainly in a big way in the 1990s, there was more attention to the need to really create an explicit mode of teaching and learning American Jews about Israel, of not relying on natural socialization. And so Yossi Beilin in 1994 proposed the idea of Beit Yisrael, which became Birthright in a Teichton for Bessert mode, I suppose. I don't know if Yossi would view it that way, but the funders, also changed it. And it's Birthright's first cohort went to Israel in 1999. I'm not going to take away any of your steam. I'm going to stop there with Birthright. The idea of the mifgash, of the direct meeting, of the idea of not only bringing people to Israel, but once they're there, trying to engineer direct meetings and interaction of American Jews and other diaspora Jews with Israelis, was also part of this teaching Israel. It was called Teaching Israel. I'm sorry that it came out so bizarrely up there. I was trying to make it big enough, and I threw the font off. The idea there, though, was that American Jews needed to be taught about Israel, that it wasn't self-evident, and there needed to be some bridges built intellectually and philosophically. And this particular pamphlet, which was one of several that the Karen Karev first issued and then is now on the website, not only of the Berman Archive, but more importantly for sponsorship, the Jewish, JAFI, the Jewish Agency for Israel, the Sochnut, had it up there. And you can see that in this case it was Arnie Eisen and the late Mike Rosenak, who were top philosophers and leaders, who tried to create a rationale of why Israel was important and how it might, not to the teachers, I think teachers felt that, but if they were trying to make a rationale that would speak to the learners, they needed a philosophical kind of program, or at least a conception. So what about Israel education? Hold off on that one, Lisa. Israel education emerged in a big way, in a more widely used way. It first appeared, I think, in 1996 in one of those pamphlets that I just mentioned. But it wasn't really used as a term of communication until after 2003. There was a report, the period that began with the end of Oslo. Oslo failed in 2000, and 2001 was the beginning of the Second Intifada. And by 2003, there were bombings, there were things going on. I don't imagine I need to remind the people in this room about that period. But 2003, a report was issued that used the title Israel Education. And there were a couple of other reports, Frank Luntz, Eminem, Israel in the Time of Eminem, and Yehuda Reinhartz and Brandeis issued a report also about Israel studies, that argued for Israel studies. There was a sense that this new environment, certainly with the Israel Education Report, growing out of the 1990s, when a generation that knew not Israel in its heroic mode was needing to be needing to be connected to Israel. But then, in addition, the political environment made things very, very complicated. So what I want to do is talk to you, especially now, about Israel education and what it's come to mean. What I did in doing the research for this over a number of years, and this research grew out of a consulting project I did with an organization called the I-Center. That's a newish organization that deals with Israel education for K through 12. But I've done other research since then. That original research involved interviews with key informants from the expert American Jewish educators from across the key institutions to see how they understood this term. Did they understand it, and what did they see as its challenges and main needs? So going to the next slide, one of the first things I did was to look at the organizations, and I don't claim this is comprehensive, but I think it's pretty representative. It's a pretty good indicator of what was going on in the 2001 to 2009 period. So there's all these organizations that were created, and I've color-coded them. And I'm going to show you in the next slide how we might think about, I group them. So I want to show you how they group. So there are, the blue lines in these, were advocacy organizations. There was a great deal of concern, particularly among funders and communal leaders, that Israel was getting beaten up in the media, that it was a tough environment, and they created a bunch of organizations. We can go back if you want to see what those were. Why don't you go back? The Myths and Facts stand with, you can read it yourself, you don't need me to read it. So those were all created straight out. And then we start to see the education organizations are fewer and far between, and they come up a bit later. So, and then there's other things called this media is like Israel 21C, which was, you could get it, I don't know if it's still around, but you would get a daily email message, a newsletter that would tell you all the great things that Israel had been creating in art and science. I mean, it was really quite impressive, but it was kind of a PR. It came across as addressing the bad image that Israel otherwise had and trying to show the good things about Israel. The green organizations I put up to show you that some of the concern about civil rights in Israel and the issues of the conflict were coming into play also on the organizational scene. So why don't we go on to the chart again? So I just wanted you to have a sense that there was a lot of organizational activity, and it involved different kinds of concerns. Okay, so now let's go dig a bit further. I asked my educators to talk to me about how they understood the difference among these different things. So I said, tell me how you view Israel education compared to, think about the field that you're in, and tell me about different buckets of concerns that you have and that the community has. And in the end, I developed this little grid that shows you how their sort of cognitive map of where education fit in compared to advocacy, branding, and Israel studies. So let's start with a comparison of Israel education and Israel studies. The informants viewed Israel studies as being university-based. It involves academic scholarship and teaching about Israel, its society, history, culture, and politics, and so on. Its purpose is to convey and develop critical knowledge without attempting to cultivate the relationship of the person who's learning about that with Israel. It's a dispassionate undertaking, although it may have byproducts that fit into the how do I feel about Israel component. But, and in contrast, one more thing. In Israel studies, you might put against Jewish studies, which also is undertaking an academically responsible, analytic, and critical stance towards its subject matter. So there's no business of being an apologist or representing Israel so much as representing the things going on there and being analytic about it. Now, in contrast to this largely, we'd have to say, agnostic stance about Israel studies regarding how the learner feels about Israel, the goal of Israel education is not just to teach about Israel, but to develop a personal connection with Israel. So in this regard, one of my interviewees said, Israel education is partisan. However, and it's unlike advocacy, which we'll get to in a minute, Israel education, while it does have an agenda of connection to Israel, does not have an explicitly political agenda. The idea is to make a connection, not to get people to take a position. The purpose is to create opportunities for learners to develop a personal connection with Israel. Okay, I want to move on to advocacy versus education next. First of all, my educators were very interested in having a chance to speak as educators in contradistinction to advocacy. Nearly all of them understood advocacy as training people, mostly of college age or late high school, primarily for political argumentation in defense of Israel, carried out especially on campus. And some of them included defending Israel in the media as well. They considered advocacy a defensive move arising from the growth of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic tropes in the media, as one person put it. They recognized that political advocacy is one activity that supporters of Israel might undertake in relation to connecting to Israel, others being fundraising, political action, learning Hebrew, keeping abreast of Israeli culture, and so on. But the educators viewed the emphasis on advocacy as different from that of education. It's not a substitute for it. And it may be telling that one of the first and main advocacy organizations, the David Project, has shifted its own mission. If you go on the website now, it says it's an education organization and it needs to build an educational base. So there is this sense that advocacy may be something that's important, but it requires an educated Jew, an educated person with a connection and understanding of Israel to be able to be an advocate. Note that advocacy underscores the adult aspect of Israel advocacy and Israel studies also, as compared to Israel education, which is across the age range. Okay, and I'm going to skip media branding. I think that it's the least important, and given that I have less time, I want to go on. I'm going to let you look at, there are 7 goals that the educators agreed on that were, they had a lot of consensus about these things, so you could look through them. Forging a relationship between the person. It's Israel education. Israel is integral to Jewish education. It promotes identity outcomes. It's learner-centered, therefore it needs certain kinds of orientations that aren't indoctrination-like. They're about growth. The most important one, if you go to the next slide for our purposes, thank you, right there, is that Israel travel and directly encountering Israelis, whether in Israel or in America, was seen as a core thing in Israel education. And we might say that Israel, as important as Israel travel is, and the Mifgash, or at least let's start with Israel travel. As important as that is, that happens in Israel. There's a counterpoint, a hand-in-hand aspect where that happens, but also in America there needs to be happening an enterprise of Israel education. Now, the last thing I want to skip to is what did educators not agree about? And there was a lot of fear in there. They reported things that were very unsettling for them, and they were worried about the context. This is the issue of, is the politics surrounding Israel part of Israel education, or should it be bracketed? That's what they were differing about. The people who worked with young children did not feel that it needed to be part of their work, by and large. Although as educators, many of them felt that they grapple with this. But anybody dealing with an adolescent or older felt that dealing with the politics surrounding Israel was part of what they had to face. Why don't we go on to the next one? This, you can read some of the comments. And finally, I want to go one more. This is the most important comment that was made, which is putting it right in front of American Jewish community, that if we're not dealing with Israel, we're actually underscoring how Israel might be pulling people away from Judaism. It's so unnerving now. So the last thing I want to do is to talk to you, go on to the next one. Keep going. I think I don't have any more slides on it, but this is what I want to point out in terms of what's going on in the educational field, and it will be a nice segue for my colleagues, I hope. The main trend since the 2000 era, and especially now in 2015, is the emergence of a paradigm of relating to Israel that is not knee-jerk, blue and white, and mythic, and all about solidarity, but one that is more black and blue. It's cognizant of the difficulties of the arena we're in, and it encourages and permits discussion of broader issues. So some of the, in the more open system in which we are today, it means you can't just focus on Israel. You have to consider Israel in its context, whether you're talking about Israel and Palestinians, its own Arab citizens, Israel within the changing Middle East, Israel and its critics, and the BDS, all the things that are going on, becomes part of the environment that any college student and adults needs to deal with. So one of the most interesting ways that educators are now addressing this is to focus on the learner's trouble with Israel and make that the starting point, making that a learning opportunity to start a conversation of inquiry. We see this in a program in Kesher Chadash. It's a program that the Jewish Theological Seminary's Davidson School runs in Israel for 6 months. It trains Israel educators. And one of the things that program does, it puts people in all kinds of fantastic settings in Israel. They really are, it's not a bubble at all, like some programs that bring Americans over and then keep them together. They're studying in Ma'alot Film School, and they're going to classes with Israeli Jewish and Arab citizens, and they're doing all kinds of things. The most recent thing they've done is to have students in this Ma'alot field film school, is they have students make a film about something that has troubled them, and they make the film and sort of they learn to decode the complexity that's around them, and to also develop a response. And they've been blogging and doing journaling and all kinds of things. And it's a way, and another example is Melissa Weintraub's efforts that's now part of the JCPA. It's called Resetting the Table, which is trying to deal with the complexity of very hot differences in the American Jewish community about Israel and how to have a civil conversation, even if people don't agree. So these kinds of more meta skills of not just trying to convey information, but make the on the one hand, one example was to show how the learner figures out how to decode and how to explore and come to terms with in some way, even if they don't agree necessarily. Or maybe they do agree, but they explore and have their own journey to making sense of what's going on. And the second example, resetting the table, is how do we as a community start to have a conversation around things that have been only very contentious up to now. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, just going to get one visual up here.
those are my visuals for today. Hi, everybody. I'm Yona. You could always scroll through if you wanted a slideshow. But so I'm going to speak today mostly as a practitioner, although it's really nice to be back at NYU, where I spent a lot of time researching these issues and looking at how Israel education was being, how basically the story of the conflict was being presented in North American Jewish high schools. But I was lured away by the field, as happens to budding Jewish academics, and now reporting to you more from the Shetach as a practitioner. And so the organization that I lead, called Encounter, brings mostly American Jewish leaders, broadly defined, also Israeli Jews, into the West Bank and East Jerusalem. This is just from a couple of weeks ago at the Educational Bookshop in East Jerusalem on Salahuddin Street, where we brought a trip from the Jewish Funders Network to meet with residents of East Jerusalem. So a little bit about Encounter as an intervention into some of the initiatives that you've heard about in terms of Israel education. It's interesting, Bethany, to have seen Encounter coded as green in your list as peace and human rights. Not that we're against those things.
That was actually from a few years ago. I was wondering how you'd
Yeah,
react,
well, it's
so.
interesting because we actually locate ourselves in the field of education, but
Right, I'll
often
change
people
it.
who think about Israel education don't think of initiatives that engage either with Arabs, Palestinians over the Green Line as education. And I would posit there's a political thing going on
Yes.
there. Whereas, of course, other initiatives that might also care about peace or whatever, but that are less kind of seen as suspiciously left-wing, they're clearly in the education sector, and then those of us that are doing something that might be taboo, in a way are marginalized by being put out of the education category. So I just want to flag that. That came up for me while seeing that. Was interesting. So Encounter brings American Jews mostly, also Israelis. You should ask me about that. We should talk about that. Into the West Bank to have direct encounters with Palestinians, but also with fellow American Jews. And I would say these are two pillars in Israel education that I think are missing. And I say this again because I'm speaking as a practitioner and not with loads of qualitative and quantitative data behind me. So you're welcome to take me to task on that. But the two pillars I think are largely missing from the wider landscape of Israel education are direct encounters with Palestinians and productive encounters with fellow Jews with whom we disagree about the conflict, and we seek to facilitate both. Largely in terms of Israel education that you'd see in day schools, Birthright, immersive experience, Masa, et cetera, all the kind of opportunities that you'd hear about young Jews spending time in Israel. There are very rarely formal, structured opportunities to engage directly with our partners, like it or not, in this conflict. A lot of the time, the legal issues prevent this. You will hear from people going on Masa programs, for example, that they're not allowed to participate in our programs because they sign a waiver at the beginning of the year not to travel over the Green Line. It would be interesting to investigate if they're allowed to go over the Green Line into settlement communities. They're not allowed to go into parts of the West Bank, Palestinian communities. So there's already this divide of a separation happening. And much of the education that happens about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Palestinians are mediated through a Jewish narrative, through Jewish texts, through Zionist texts, through the way we and I'm problematizing the we, of course, but through the way we tell that story. So you may recall last year the big scandal in the New York Times where Ramaz, the Orthodox Jewish high school on the Upper East Side, withdrew its invitation to Rashid Khalidi from coming to speak to its politics club. It's not surprising. What was surprising is that the students had actually reached out to him and invited him to come. This past September encounter, we brought a speaker from the West Bank into Ramaz to come and speak with the politics club, partially as our offer to them was to create a tikkun. But the idea being that direct engagement, directly talking to Palestinians, and it doesn't have to mean that you agree with them. In fact, we encourage people to come and listen, argue, not necessarily endorse what they have to say, but that we are, to our own detriment, dumbing down the content by rendering Palestinians invisible in the way that we teach about Israel. So that's one of the pieces that Encounter tries to help address. We bring mostly who we define as Jewish leaders. I would say that we have kind of been accused of being elitist in who we seek to recruit. We don't take, for example, Hillel directors will call us and ask us to bring their campus participants that are going on a birthright trip. Could they please come on an encounter trip right after that? We actually seek to bring people who are already attached to Israel, who have already spent time in Israel, who are pursuing graduate degrees either in Jewish communal service, Israel education, the rabbinate, academics, and then we also, about 20% of our alumni population are what we call sort of established leaders. We have brought members of the Conference of Presidents every year around the Conference of Presidents. We recruit Conference of Presidents members, Jewish Funders Network, Federation executives. We had a really amazing, fascinating trip to Hebron with President of American Friends of Likud and President of Americans for Peace Now, who had both served in the Conference of Presidents together for 12 years but had never spoken to each other before they came on the trip with us. And I say that because the Harif, sort of like sexy, provocative piece of encounters work often that appeals to people is, oh, you're going to meet with Palestinians. But the more radical component often can be actually what we do on our trips is the small group discussions where we engineer putting who we identify as left-wing and right-wing and centrists all together in small groups to have intentional conversation about the very things that they normally avoid talking about. So I would say that these are two components that, in terms of policy implications for Israel education, I think there are many different ways in which we could probably improve the ways in which we teach about Israel to American Jews that would seed both of those opportunities, either engaging directly with Palestinian texts. People, for us, I would say our model draws, of course, on the birthright model. We use travel as an educational tool. Place is a text as much as, a piece of paper. The separation barrier from the checkpoint 300 on the Bethlehem side near Rachel's tomb is a text, and it's being narrated by a different set of narrators of the conflict than our participant group usually gets to hear from. Seeing Gilo or seeing the Canyon Malcha from the other side, quote unquote, or seeing the Temple Mount from the East Jerusalem side. These are texts in a form of what we believe is Israel education going towards the heat as opposed to trying to avoid it. The gentleman earlier who asked a question about Jewish camp, it's interesting, if only that were a solution, but I can assure you from having facilitated a group of 60 educators right before the start of this school year, both camp educators, Hebrew school educators, and day school educators, even if they wanted to ignore it, this summer made it impossible that summer camps had to contend with what was going on in Israel this past summer. And so and they are unprepared. They're not prepared to be able to cope with it. So there's a sense of anxiety and crisis. Encounter also draws on the tool of mifgash. Birthright, from when I led a birthright trip, of course, one of the most impressive and impression-making pieces of the program is the time that you spend with real Israelis. And of course, our model is a double mifgash, a two-pronged mifgash, the direct encounter with Palestinians, which include, and it's deliberate on our part, which include a diversity of Palestinians, Muslim, Christian, young, old, covered, not covered, religious, secular, people who are arguing for a two-state solution, people who are arguing that it's dead and there's only one-state solution, people who are against the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and people who are arguing that that's the only tool that they have left. And part of that is to help break up this unfortunate vision that we have as a monolith of the Palestinian people as one thinking unit, when in fact there are fault lines. This is obvious, of course, but there are real fault lines within the Palestinian community and real debates about how to move forward that Jewish educators, rabbis, members of the Conference of Presidents don't know about. And they find this an opportunity that helps them have a more enriched and informed, hopefully, experience. We frame the trips very clearly as political. I feel suspect of anyone who claims that any kind of Israel education is apolitical. That to me is red flags and bells going off. We are very clearly offering a form of political education, but we are nonpartisan. And by that, it's not wordsmithing. It's really very true in the sense that we're not saying when you're done with an encounter trip, okay, now here's your bucket list of solutions that you can go and lobby your congressperson or your rabbi to now execute. I wish we did have that. It makes it very complicated when funders and others want to know what's the impact of your trip. How can you prove how you're making a difference? People are not so interested in complexifying things, and that's what we're in the business of doing. I would say that, of course, and I'll be interested to hear Shoal talk about it because Shoal's had the experience also of being on an encounter trip, although a unique one, of the politics of not including those voices. I think we get, because it's seen still as taboo, questioned a lot on what does it mean that you're sort of prioritizing the Palestinian narrative. Well, we're not really, we're prioritizing it because we see it missing from the larger landscape. And I'd be interested to hear how you all also think about the politics of it not being included in other pieces. One of the things that Encounter also seeks to address, Melissa Weintraub, who Lisa just mentioned her initiative, Resetting the Table, is a co-founder of Encounter. The model of civil conversation started 10 years ago on encounter trips, where she very wisely understood that this was a subject that was pulling apart the community and that we needed micro opportunities with microcosms of the community to start having these difficult conversations. We have a very kind of tight, regimented facilitation program, and people often come off the trip saying it's the first time that they've been able to have an honest conversation with their colleagues, and that ranges from people in their 20-somethings, 30-somethings, 50 and 60-somethings. We have also done a little bit here in North America, which is less, it's sort of more experimental. That's what I mentioned about bringing speakers to the American Jewish community. But I think it speaks to, this is just how I'll close, it speaks to a little bit of some of the themes that we heard our speakers talk about in the first panel, which is this idea of moving away from just uniform attachment and recognizing that we're living in an age of political diversity. And that's true even amongst our younger, I'm not talking about early childhood to middle school kids, but high school, later high school and older. We need to start introducing that earlier because, of course, that's why we're facing this crisis right now on college campuses. These students are encountering Palestinians and political diversity and polarization, and sometimes for the first time, and they're unprepared to cope with it. So I think I'll stop there and wait till there's questions. Thank you.
Okay, Cheryl?
Yeah, great.
I'm just
Okay.
going to close this down.
I have no visuals. All right. So I want to think about the missions of Israel Experience programs, Israel Travel, in the context of Israel education. I'll probably do a little bit more unpacking of the term Israel education itself. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, great, thanks. Israel Experience Travel goes back to the pre-state era, and it has developed in a number of iterations over the decades from something that was oriented largely to leaders of youth movements and high schools, to, in the 1980s, trying to democratize that, still keeping it focused at the high school level. I'm speaking about short-term programs, but trying to go beyond the leadership of youth groups to the birthright model, which says, which shifts to focus on college age and also to expand the reach of these programs more. But the Israel to which these programs are going and are traveling is a changing Israel, and the relationship between American Jews and this Israel that they're visiting is a changing relationship. And as Dov really framed for us, and where most of the conversation has been, we're in a moment where Israel has gone from something that was clearly a unifier in the American Jewish community to something that polarizes. And travel as a form of education in that context is fraught, and there are a number of issues that are raised for people who are interested in organizing, running these types of programs, participating in these types of programs, or more broadly, for people who care about these programs and care about what they can do for the relationship. We spent a lot of time talking about the issue of Israel attachment, and the basic model that really has certainly motivated the birthright trip. I think it underlies a lot of the precursors as well, is that when you have a group of people who live an ocean away from a country, who may not have direct family ties there, that one of the best ways, or at least an effective way, of creating a sense of connection to this place that is in so many ways a foreign country is to take them to this place and to create a certain type of experience there that will be an emotionally compelling experience. The major goal for Birthright is and those who are familiar disagree with me in the Q&A. The major goal for Birthright is the creation of a sense of connection, a sense of attachment, and a sense, and I say a sense, I want to say a feeling. It's emotional, and it is about closeness. I spent better part of a decade looking at what happens on the trips themselves. My research is not about what happens after. It's all about what goes on while they're there. And if I had to summarize on one foot my major conclusion from the research, it's that this enterprise, it's designed to create feelings of attachment, has certain aspects that are inherently built into travel and tourism itself that create a sense of distance. And that complicates things. And so we're spending time talking about attachment, but here in this session where we're talking about Israel Experience programs, we're looking at a medium that does not only create attachment, it creates distance as well. And that's something that I want to unpack and that I think we need to look at. Now, certainly for programs like Encounter, the goal of emotional attachment is not that is not the issue. So when we think about Israel Experience programs, it's important to recognize there are a diversity of programs that are bringing Americans, American Jews, over to Israel, and with a whole host of goals. Some are about fostering emotional attachment. Some are about engaging critical thinking around very complex issues. Some are about creating empathy for people who are living there on all sides of this conflict, but living in a really fraught situation. Some are going to simple issues of familiarity. It may not be about the Knesset members, but it may be knowing what bamba is and what it tastes like. I think if we frame the conversation about Israel Experience programs in terms of attachment only, we're going to miss something important. The term itself, attachment, I find collapses, and I want to propose a different term, at least for the sake of this discussion, which is citizenship. That American Jewish citizenship involves some type of knowledge and participation in conversations with other Jews and others related to Israel. How as global Jewish citizens does the Israel Experience program actually foster a greater sense of global Jewish citizenship? And citizenship creates a space for talking about emotional connections. It also creates a space for talking about critical engagement. Someone who comes back from a birthright trip and joins Jewish Voice for Peace, I don't know where the person is who asked the question, may take issue with the idea that that their engagement in Jewish Voice for Peace is a form of attachment to Israel. But I would be very surprised if they took issue with the notion that their coming back from birthright and getting involved with JVP is not a form of enhanced global Jewish citizenship. So I think it's a term that actually helps to bring together a lot of the different aspects of the programs. So in this context, in a context of travel to a place that used to unify much more than it does now, and now increasingly polarizes, what are the key issues that really are on the table for those who are involved in these programs? I'll say that there are three, at least three that I want to focus on. One is staying humanistic in the educational model. I'll go into each of these. The second is keeping open a space for questioning, for critique and for dissent. And the third is providing a language that affirms diaspora and that affirms the American Jewish experience. I see these as the three basic challenges that Israel Experience programs at this moment of transition in the relationship are facing. So let's go first with staying humanistic. I had, in my notes on this, I had spoken about a state-centered rationale. Bethany probably had a better term, advocacy. Advocacy. When Birthright Israel was established, it was established in the 1990s. The first trips were launched in '99. And in the 2 years leading up to that, as the program is being conceptualized, it's being conceptualized in a moment where Barak and Arafat and Clinton are negotiating. The millennium is approaching and peace is at hand. You had North American Jewish funders and communal leaders who were looking mostly to 1990 and the National Jewish Population Survey and worrying that the American Jewish community is going to disappear through assimilation. And Birthright Israel emerges in a context where Israel is seen as a solution to American Jewish problems of assimilation. The state is serving its diaspora. Israel is serving American Jews. Come the Second Intifada, after Birthright has already been established and is up and running, another voice comes into the conversation about what the mission of the program is, and that voice is, the conflict's not ending. Looks like it's going to go on. It looks like it's going to get worse. Israel, which we thought was on the cusp of peace, is once again embattled. And American Jews need to rally to the support of their embattled homeland. How can participation in Birthright, how can actually bringing American Jewish young adults help to rally support, to build advocates for an embattled Israel in this moment of the Second Intifada? And that tension between the advocacy rationale, the rationale where the participants, American Jews, serve the state, versus the founding rationale where the state is serving American Jews and their identity-related issues is a core tension that I think that exists in the program and has existed from the moment that the Second Intifada brought this new discourse about what the purpose of this program was. And the challenge has been to maintain a space for learners to think and to grow and to explore and to not reduce the individual participants to potential ideological soldiers for the state, but rather to maintain that sense that this is an educational program about human growth. There are a number of things that are in some ways built into travel itself and that are also built in to Israel Experience travel, both Birthright and Encounter, that are essentially the bulwarks against taking what is a very powerful medium. You take a group of people out of their normal environments, you put them in a group that you craft for a limited period of time, and you control the environment, you can control the basic orientation of the narrative that you're going to be giving. There's a lot that you can do to shape this environment, and that power is something that brings ethical responsibilities as to how it's used. So the two bulwarks that actually help to make sure that this medium of organized travel remains something that's being used in a humanistic sense is, one, the educational frame and the educational training of the people who are involved in it, the professional ethic and the professional ethos of educators who would see using this medium in order to create people who will march lockstep, to follow the dictates of the government and it's in the midst of its political conflicts, who would see that as anathema. That they look back to Dewey and they look to their own sense of themselves as educators whose responsibility, first and foremost, before to any collective, is a responsibility to their students as individuals. And the fact that these programs are the curricula for the programs are in the hands of educators is one of the most important bulwarks for preventing a preventing the travel from being used in ways to indoctrinate. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. The second is that the medium itself is a complicated medium, and this brings us to the second point, which is the importance, thank you, of keeping open a space for questioning, critique, and dissent. Now, these are the issues that Israel Experience programs are dealing with, whether it's Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whether it's issues of religion and state, whatever. These are complicated issues. And although the organizers of these programs have the ability to shape the curriculum and to essentially set the terms of what people are going to be talking about and what they're going to be looking at, the medium of tourism is hard to control, and it's hard to control in a number of ways. First, there is always a gap between what is written on paper in terms of the curriculum/itinerary and how these things get implemented in practice. The guides themselves and the people who are running the trips on the ground have a lot of autonomy, for good and for ill. So that also it also provides some wiggle room to prevent these from becoming indoctrinating. Beyond that, travel has inherent distancing effects. Let me add also that there are voices on the program that are not being paid by the program, that is to say the participants themselves, and their voices are as much a part of the experience as what the guide says. So the guide may be speaking up in the front of the group, and if on the bus someone's supposed to, yeah, leave that, I'll tell you something else, that makes a difference, and that definitely happens on these trips. There are many voices that are coming forward, and that also creates complexity. In terms of keeping an open space for questioning, critique, and dissent, this medium that is in some ways framed, certainly in the birthright context, framed as promoting attachment, is using a medium that implies distancing. They're taking people to a country where they do not speak the language, where if they do not have the hotel set up for them, they will not have a place to sleep. They need the guides, they need all of the mediating institutions that the tourism industry provides in order to help people navigate. It gives them their daily schedule. But all of this, at the same time that they'll come into Ben Gurion Airport and they get to the luggage, they're getting their luggage, and the guide will say, welcome home. Before they get there, they have to go through passport control. And passport control, the message there is not welcome home. The message is, where do you really belong, and show me those papers. Okay, you're allowed in, but you're only allowed in for a certain amount of time. There are many things you can't do. You can't get a job here, for example. You are not at home here. And that's the first message that people receive even before they receive that welcome home. Over the course of these trips, that dialectic between the sense of belonging and attachment and connection and that sense of foreignness, and for the Americans or Canadians, and Americanness or Canadianness, is very much at play. The experience of having both of these, a sense of connection and a sense of distancing, creates an experience, certainly on the birthright side, ambivalence is not the right word, but it's certainly more complex than anyone who thinks this is solely about Israel attachment would imagine would come out of the trips. What the trips do not do, however, is to provide a language for participants to explain what they're understanding in terms of their distancing. It certainly provides a language to explain what they're feeling in terms of their connection. And that ability to provide a framing language is a very powerful piece of how people understand their experience. But in terms of the ways in which in which people are being given a language, the language that affirms their diaspora experience is not something that's there. Some of the participants may come to it themselves, but it's certainly not something that's being provided. Am I out of time?
Got 2 more.
Okay, all right. Without American triumphalism, we're at a moment in the relationship between American Jews and Israel where it would probably behoove the American organizers of these trips to look back to Ben Gurion and to Blaustein, rather than to look to when Netanyahu came to Congress and said he spoke for all Jews, Ben-Gurion said no, and Blaustein agreed no. And this is a moment in the relationship in which if American Jews are going to be using travel to Israel as a way of engaging thinking around American Jewish identity and global Jewish citizenship to provide a language that will help the American travelers to understand their own Jewish experience as an experience of co-equal value with the Israeli Jewish experience is something that's missing from these programs and is not serving the present moment. I'm going to leave it with that, and we'll open up the questions.
Okay, thank you all. So I think I will start as we did in the first session by asking if each of you have a question you want to ask somebody else on the panel.
I have a question. So, Bethany, you have an educator who said that Israel turns off Jews not just from Israel but from Judaism. And I'm wondering empirically, from the data, how true is that? Is it true only of some segments? And why does the educator have the sense that that's happening?
Well, again, the data here were people's own reporting of their interpretations, their experience. It was 24 people. Actually, I have one of my interviewers here, Galia Avidar. And they were expert educators, so they were reporting their experience working, in this case, that was somebody who works with high school students in this person teaches around the New York area and has been in not only Jewish, schools, but also like the Dalton School where this person was brought to the parents and the kids. So the data are through the lens of this person, and I don't think you're going to find that kind of outcome in the Orthodox world. Although I wouldn't rule it out either. I mean, I think the Ramaz story, which was important to follow, and then I didn't know that you had done
Didn't
it.
make the New York Times.
I didn't know you did the second one, but I mean, there's a lot of questioning around this, whether it's making people question their Judaism in the Orthodox world. I would find that a little harder to believe, but it is making more of a separation between the sense that you're Jewish and the sense that Israel necessarily is feeding your Jewishness. And it leads me to ask you a question, which was, I was interested that you are focusing on a notion of citizenship. If it's global citizenship, I can understand it, but I feel that one of the things that I'm seeing in the current configuration is that the presumption that we're joined at the hip, American Jews and Israel, I think needs to be treated as, we shouldn't treat it as a given. And if anything, maybe, in families, when family members are over-identified one with the other, the family is not so healthy. So if we took a family analogy, and it's an analogy, and you said, let's have a little more separation of our own distinctive identities as American Jews and as Israel, in relation to Israel, which is a state, it would be a better thing. And this, I guess I'm not asking you a question, but insofar as the function of Israel is helping our ethno-religious solidarity, that's been powerful in the past, and it's not so powerful now. But it's mostly because Israel's existence as a state has become so, it's 60-some years, what is it, what are we up to now, 68?
67.
We're coming up to 68, right?
7.
Seven, I'm sorry, I can't do the math, right, exactly. We're coming up to 67 years, so, in the New State period, the connections were powerful and flagged, and flagged meaning they were out there all the time, and now even the Israelis aren't flagging identity. They're trying to be more normal about it, even though the situation they're in isn't so normal. So I'm just wondering about your use of the term citizenship in that context, where I think you were arguing for distinctiveness. So it seems sort of funny to hear that.
What's interesting, if you think about it as a family versus citizenship is a political
Right.
model, family is not, and we'll probably agree that attachment is an impoverished term. If we're looking for a different language than the broad metaphor that we're using, if it's a citizenship model, if it's a family model, is going to suggest different things. I haven't thought through what the family model would would look like, I would imagine that there are ways in which a family model, it's going to mediate this relationship between closeness and connection and distance and separation, aspects that are shared and aspects that are distinct. How does it do that differently than a citizenship model would? If I find, as I've spoken about American Jewish relations with Israel over the years, one of my mantras has been that the conversations that we have typically focus on at the level of political symbolism, and I'm doing this here. I'm participating in it, and there are other models that we could be thinking about, and I think about this is Ahad Ha'am is nowhere in this conversation, right? But you think about what type of relationship between American Jews and Israel he would have been talking about, and we're going to have the whole conversation about this conflict over the politics here. In a lot of ways, American Jews have related to Israel as a political symbol of religious Jewish history, exile, return, death and resurrection, and the like. Now, Ahad Ha'am was saying, no, independent Hebrew culture that is going to radiate outward to inspire American Jewish life. Let's leave we could leave the politics out. If we were to look at attachment to Israel in that sense, we would probably find very low levels of attachment. Maybe Israeli dancing at some point. Movies, art and synagogue gift shops. Right? Okay, you're right. Yeah. Okay, so maybe it's higher. But we could be having a conversation about this relationship that is not about Israel as a symbol of national redemption, but rather this is a vibrant, productive Jewish culture that is enriching and informing our own Jewish lives here in America, our own cultural lives. That's not the conversation that we're having. So we have a citizenship conversation, we have a family conversation. I don't know what the other it's an arts and culture, but it's something separate. We could do that too.
Okay. So a couple of the conundrums that I've been thinking about, and I'll ask one question and then I'm going to open it up. One conundrum is that the vast majority of American Jews, whatever education they have about Israel, is either taking place in congregational or day schools and camps, and or with birthright. And in all of those areas, the principal focus is on developing emotional attachment. With the exception of the content that they get is more of an advocacy-oriented content. In many day schools across the country, the content curriculum that they're giving is more of an advocacy-oriented content than it is in Israel education in the way that we're thinking about it. So on the one hand, we're trying to cultivate this warm connection, this emotional positive connection, which goes very much against the model that you just outlined, Shaul, of really opening for critical thinking, for the opportunity for questioning, for dissent, for that humanistic orientation, which I think is the ideology that Encounter is trying to, but that creates a real great dissonance. So how do we bridge that dissonance, particularly when educators are so invested in connecting, and this is the other piece of the conundrum sorry that this is going on, that there's this instrumental notion of Israel, that Israel, and that's the second, Israel is there to reinforce me as an American Jew, to build up my identity as an American Jew, and yet you go to Israel and you feel distant, whether it's at passport control or whether because your kind of Judaism isn't recognized or you feel that way at least. So those are the two of the many challenges that I think we have in trying to articulate the purposes of Israel education in a way that can help us overcome these barriers that exist in how we educate towards Israel. So I'd love to hear a couple of comments about that. I think it's to you. It's to all of you.
I'll say something. I think that your presentation of where messages about Israel, you're talking about what educates American Jews about Israel. You're talking about schools and camps, but there's a broader range of influence, obviously, other socializing agents and, media and everything else that's going on, the environment in which we live, which is so different from, let's say, when we were young. You didn't, first of all,
Well, that's
I
another
remember
source of
even when I was
business.
in graduate school, we were coding, we were getting the newspapers from every different place that we were studying. When I was studying Arab-Israeli conflict, you couldn't get the newspapers easily online. Online didn't exist, but you didn't read the different Arab papers or the Israeli papers. You maybe got the Jerusalem Post in the United States, but your rabbi was a message, and what you read in the general
Right.
news was limited, and so you didn't have access. And now you have the whole cacophony and interaction at the level, everything is available and it's being, and on the one hand, people note all the time how we have these very specialized little, environments where you only talk to the people who agree with you. But the fact is, we're aware that there's, of the different views in a way that was not possible before. So I think that it may not be, I'm arguing, and I think the educators were arguing that I spoke with, but those who work with teenagers and adults, that having some help to figure out how to navigate that is now part of the agenda. And while there are things going on in schools and in camps, not every Jewish kid goes there. And when you get what's so interesting about campus now is when campuses are heated up, it brings everybody, every student, and a lot of our children, our young people, they go to college, so they're in places where they hear about things, and then what their opportunities are for, certainly Hillel is telling them, we're doing it our way, and then we have Open Hillel that's saying, well, we want to talk to more people. It's the Ramaz thing built larger, and what are the venues and possibilities there? That's still structured in the old way, that the Jewish community will control and be in charge of Israel education, and I think we have a more open system. So even in portraying it as you did, that the socializing agents are us. It's not only us. That's
No,
my
of
main.
course.
That's sort of a long comment on your question.
Just quickly, and then throw it to Yonah, because you're actually doing the citizenship education. Jews who are engaged in communal life are citizens in their Jewish community, like it or not, and we're not framing our conversation about education to prepare them for that.
Right.
Agreed. I think the one thing I would add into the conversation, it's less about what's happening, is that there is a whole backdrop of funding that we need to
Yes.
acknowledge.
Oh, boy.
And
So of course,
funders.
well, and funders, and so the term funder education is not always popular, and I also think it's a little bit naive. At the end of the day, we have to look at where the money is, and we're around this issue, or certainly the issue that I'm involved in. We're in a culture war, and all we have to do is look to what happened when Eric Fingerhut withdrew from his promise to speak at the J Street conference, and then sort of. The J Street U students are very sophisticated right now, and they're growing in their activism, and he reframed in the end because they kind of marched over to the Hillel offices. But you see, there was a part of me thinking when all of that's going on, Eric Fingerhut is a casualty of the larger moment that we're
Yes.
sitting in,
Yeah.
which is that we have, in that case in particular, right, probably very right-wing donors that made it very clear that his job would be had if he showed up at J Street. The problem is those funders so desperately want to reach the very population that then took him to task for not showing up. And so I think there has to be a more honest conversation with people who are enabling the educational agenda through their funds to help them understand that they're actually going to turn away a lot of the population that they want to reach.
But it gets to how funders understand education and their job. I mean, they're not educators, they're funders, and they're looking for certain outcomes. So they're in a way more indoctrination
more,
oriented,
yeah,
or
working-
like,
yeah.
so it's really
They're
a
working
problem.
across
And
businesses,
this
except for
dynamic
our
of
funders.
the people on the ground, the programs being intimidated by the funders or having to not offend their funders is a real problem. It came up with, I can name names, but I don't want to put anybody in an odd situation. It's a real problem.
All right, let's take a couple of questions. We'll go here first. We'll gather a few, and then we'll.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. It's a very interesting panel. I believe that you're looking in the wrong direction in education in Israel, or particularly in education and maybe in our very own. That the future is global economics and finance, and Israel is doing rather well in its industry, new industry. It's medical industry, it's industrial industry, industrial meaning ideas of making armaments. And so
Okay,
forth.
the question, please?
And the question is, how is the educational system directing to the future, using your own strengths?
Okay. David?
Two quick questions. Bethany, I'm wondering,
Oh, hi, David.
you and I participated in a great example of Israel studies at the academic level, the Schusterman Institute. I wonder what you see as the application of that to Israel education at different levels, on a more elementary level.
The application
are
of-
there takeaways
Of having been in the Schusterman Israel
their approach,
Institute.
their philosophy?
Of
That's
Israel,
one quick question.
the relationship between Israel studies and Israel education?
Yeah, we were on a faculty
Yeah, yeah.
seminar for 2 weeks that was, where
So
people,
my
yeah.
other quick question is to pick up on Shaul's last point, which I thought was so fascinating, the idea that we need to bolster diaspora identity and diaspora issues as well. Shaul, are you suggesting that either part of Israel education or partnered with Israel education, we should be promoting American Jewish education as well, or in some combination? I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, okay, yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry.
So what I'm hearing from the panel is kind of like, Israel education needs to be reformulated in a way that's compatible with critical inquiry and liberal political culture and pluralism and things like that. And I'm very personally sympathetic with that. But there are, I think, people that aren't represented on this panel who would say, just to play the devil's advocate, they would say, if you do that, then really the whole ethnic project's going to unravel, and all the Jews will end up being in JVP or worse. They'll be anti-Zionist, and the whole community will collapse, and that the mainstream Jewish community is actually feeding into this framework by talking about Israel's democratic elements of its democratic political culture and its economic achievements and things like that. And what's really needed is kind of like a more robust identity narrative that taps into like the mythological and heroic aspects of Jewish peoplehood and focuses on concepts of like indigeneity I hear a lot. And so I'm just wondering how you guys would respond to those people, how you would say that, no, you're wrong, in fact.
Okay, why don't we
You believe
take
they're wrong.
those three, and then we'll move on.
Go ahead. I need to think more.
Okay. All right, I'll take them in order. There are programs, there are Israel Experience programs oriented toward postgraduates that are bringing them there for internships and work. So that is something that people who are interested in creating connections with Israel are looking at as a way of building connections. It's not around the ideology, it's around, you're going into finance and we're going to get you an internship with the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange or something like that. So that stuff exists, and the field is a very robust field. There's a lot that's going on. This is a piece of it. With regard to David's question about diaspora education promoting American Jewish education, yes, that is what I'm arguing. And let me give you a few of the subpoints. One, with regard to so part of the power of the Israel experience, of the birthright type of trip in particular, is that it grounds people in a coherent, overarching Jewish narrative that connects history and their own personal experience. I grew up in central New Jersey, right near Molly Pitcher's Well, where the Battle of Monmouth was fought. There is another overarching narrative that I can ground myself in, and it is a meaningful narrative. There is not a single narrative that we can locate ourselves in, and if we limit ourselves, we're impoverishing ourselves. There are powerful American Jewish narratives that we could and should be telling, and we should be thinking about what are the American Jewish stories that we want to be telling to ourselves, about ourselves, and to what end. So there's that. And then the second piece is that we know from Israel Experience Travel that we have a very powerful medium, which is educational travel. And we use it very well in Israel, and we use it very well in Poland, and we have good trips to the Lower East Side and coming to New York. My son's going to be on one in June. We could be doing a lot more. Every single place I teach a class in the sociology of tourism at Vanderbilt. Every single place has a story, has stories that we can tell about it, and we can make meaning out of our own places. And we're underutilizing something that we have the real potential with. And finally, to Matt's question, I think that a part of citizenship, and the case that I would make is that citizenship is not only critique, and if the extent of your notion of citizenship is critique, that's going to collapse. There needs to be, citizenship also includes myth, it also includes pride, it also includes emotional connections to unifying symbols. That's a piece of citizenship as well. You know, we're going into an election year here. We're at some point, you know, on Inauguration Day, we're going to all come back together, you know, for that aspect of the unifying dimension of citizenship. But there are, you know, and in terms of Jewish global citizenship and American Jewish citizenship, you know, that unifying piece also needs to be a part of it. Citizenship creates the space for exactly those types of connections, but it doesn't limit it to that, because that alone is not citizenship, and it's not patriotism, it's jingoism, and you need to have that broader thing to sort of balance.
I mean, I would agree. I would just say from where I sit in terms of what we do, I certainly and I say this when I'm on the trips, to me, this shouldn't be someone's Israel experience coming on a trip with us. Encounter, I see actually as a complement or an intervention into a wider landscape that I think is very important. I came to this work as a Jewish educator, as someone who was very invested in Israel education. But these two, for me, the absence of actually having the opportunity to engage Palestinians and to be able to engage fellow Jews with whom I disagree, I actually think those are threats to the very things that you were talking about. We espouse a kind of cognitive pluralism within Judaism, Shivim Panim La Torah, 70 Faces of Torah, that we can have all these different debates. And it seems that in a lot of the spaces where Jewish education occurs, that pluralism ends at the subject of Israel. And I think that that is at our own disservice.
Rather than responding to each of these comments, the one thing that I thought was really interesting across them is the theme of diversity, because in the good old days, you know, in my youth, Israel was the mythic Israel isn't diverse. And what we have now is Israel with many, many components and elements and people and ideas, and you've got the high tech, and you've got, I mean, you referred to it when you talked about the different programs, that some engender empathy and some do this and so, but there's just such a complex story there. You can't tell a story about Israel, and I think the attempts to sort of push for complexity in splaying out, moving away from a myth to some a variety of realities is very important. And then at the same time, on the American Jewish side, you get a variety of ways of being Jewish and connecting, and they're not all the same, and nor should we expect them to be. So I think that's a virtue. What do I want to do with that? I lost my train here. Oh, but one thing I think is, I want to just pick up on this issue of what do American Jews, since we have a situation where it used to be Israel was sort of, you know, at the top and American Jews were at the bottom, and now it's gotten more horizontal where there's a parity, more of a parity and an interchange model between American Jews and Israel and Israelis. I mean, I think one of the things that that we see, first of all, is that a lot of these efforts now are being founded by they're owned by American Jews. They're not from Israel given to American Jews. So there's more investigatory possibilities going on. And the last thing I want to say is that American Jewish sense of themselves as Americans really offers something into a conversation with Israel. This doesn't get to your question of what would we say to the, quote unquote, the people that aren't the most liberal. But I just still want to say that the issues around our American Jewish commitments as Americans to civil rights, to liberty, to democracy are, this isn't anything new that I'm saying, but it belongs in the conversation, that's a really important note to be sounding in relation to Israel, and we have more and more of an opportunity to do it. So while I agree with Shaul that citizenship has things that are both unifying, and then we can also American citizenship has the ability to be able to tolerate diversity that I'm not sure that Jews always do themselves. And in Israel, the ability to tolerate diversity and to embrace it is something that I think is sorely needed. So I'm sorry to be so all over the place, but this issue of diversity and who is used to doing it, I think that as Americans, we've done better and worse, but it's part of our ethos. Even if we have red and blue states and all, we have struggles about it, but there's still like we're all. It's a e pluribus unum, and I don't think Israel has that as much with the cookie cutter notions of from earlier in its life about what Israelis ought to be. So.
Okay. Yeah, in the back there.
There's a whole world of Jewish education relating to Israel that hasn't yet been touched on, and that's the experience of young Orthodox Jews who complete their high school education,
Yes.
then go and spend a year in Israel.
Yes.
How does that inform the debate around the table? How does that inform the Israel experience for Americans?
I think it's a hugely important thing, and I haven't researched it yet. So it's on my agenda, not only, because the Orthodox world has a wide range even within it. So, if you look at what's going on in Aguda schools around Yom HaAtzmaut, they're not doing Israel, they're not doing a whole blue and white thing in the Haredi community. That's just not part of what they do. And I know you're talking about trips to Israel, but I'm talking about the Israel education piece that happens here. There's a lot of diversity. And it requires some inquiry, and I just, in this particular inquiry that I did, it wasn't part of the deal at that time, but it's part of my own program of research to expand into that and understand how that plays out.
Yeah, let's take a couple. You want to say?
Oh,
Well, I just
sorry.
want to say I
Yeah.
haven't researched it, but we're a tiny organization and a huge thing. And that, I think, is going to be a growing issue given the demographics
Yeah.
that we're seeing. But we do, in this small way, we do run a trip every year. Ours is coming up actually April 30th. It's a gap year trip that's actually for Orthodox students who are spending the year in Israel. And most of them are actually studying in yeshivot and seminaries over the Green Line, which makes for very fascinating 2 days. to be
Although I
spent
do
there.
want to say that I did, in starting to expand my inquiry, I did visit a couple of places, one of which I don't want to name names because they didn't give me permission, but they're an intensive yeshiva, not the most orthodox kind. And they had never viewed it as their job. They viewed their business as being in the teaching of texts. And when I did this interview a year and a half ago, what I learned was that much to their surprise, in this more recent period, they've been around for 25 years, so in the more recent period, in the past 5 to 10 years, they realized, don't take the encounter figures into this, they realized that there's, as the person said to me, we teach them for, I don't know, hundreds of days in the year, and they go on an encounter trip, and then they have questions. And no, wait, so wait a minute. So he put it that way, and then he said, but we learned from this that we need to use Encounter, and our students are going to go on Encounter, and they're going to go on, we want to take them on different trips, and we want to bring our faculty with us.
I have to just.
Well, let me just finish. So,
you're not done.
I'm not. No, so I didn't mean to do a blow to you because I'm a big fan, but what was interesting.
It's not a compliment. It's a compliment.
What was interesting was that now this institution structures into its work. It never realized it had to do Israel education, but now it views its job not only as teaching text, but bringing the faculty, some of whom live across the Green Line, to these trips, and then they all discuss it together, and the students see their rebbeim also hearing voices from, go to hear Jewish people in Hebron, and they go to hear people, Palestinians, and they all relate to it, and they've even begun a conflict resolution program.
Yeah.
So-
Well, I'm happy to speak about a particular institution that resonates for me with.
That is at this
yes.
point.
Well, but the thing is, it's not only that institution. That happens to be Pardes as an institution that actually would never allow Encounter to recruit from its students. But part of what happened, this is a perfect instance. They forbid the staff and alumni from even posting a flyer on the institution walls. They were forbidding their students from coming. Well, the second you say it's verboten, where do you think the students are going to go? And so many of the Pardes students then became Encounter alumni. Some of them are now our staff. The Pardes then felt they could no longer ignore us. But they wouldn't go with Encounter into the West Bank, but what they started to do is organize trips to Hebron to meet with Palestinians and to meet with Palestinian neighbors to those that are living in Efrat. And we did actually take a group of the Pardes senior leadership on an Encounter trip.
That's what they told me.
Begrudgingly. They were not happy about it. I think it's a huge win. I don't
Yeah.
care if they go with Encounter, but that they are now beginning to
Yes.
confront those issues is precisely why we exist. We lit a fire, and I think it's a good thing. They are not alone. The dean of one of the major rabbinical schools in the United States, which shall remain nameless, who is
How many are
sympathetic sympathetic to Encounter, said to me the same thing. Well, we have progressive Jewish students coming to Israel, and they go on Encounter for 36 hours, and you're destroying their Jewish identity, which, by the way, is not true.
Yeah.
That's not true at all. Many people, to the person who asked, many people, I forgot I wanted to say this too, many people come on Encounter trips actually then say, now I found that I can actually be in a Jewish community and engage in those conversations. They want back in. But to this dean, I said, Im kol hakavod, you have 5 campuses across the United
Now we
States.
know
You have
what
a budget. Well, I don't think she'd mind. You have a budget that puts we're $700,000 organization. You have a budget that puts us to shame. You have world-class scholars, and you have these students for 5 years. If you're telling me that a day and a half with Jewish educators in the West Bank is destroying their Jewish identity, you are doing a very bad job. And I'd be happy to sit with you and talk about what a robust Israel education looks like.
Okay, all right.
And by the way, there's other institutions. I mean, there's been things at Hadar. I mean, you can name all, Hebrew College, across,
I think
you know,
that, right.
across the board.
there, For sure. Okay, Stephen, and then you in the back. And
I
then
am Stephen Cohen of Hebrew Union College.
Jewish Institute.
And an Encounter alumni.
In answer to Ron's question, Shalom Berger has a book called Flipping Out.
Yes.
It's actually worth looking at. The question that I had is an emerging question that's become more apparent now. I started with Bethany's wonderful category, like it's just 4 categories, but 3 of them were right-wing Israel education, left-wing Israel education, and putatively nonpartisan Israel education. That's my renaming.
That's your Peirush, yeah.
That's
No,
my
no,
renaming.
I wouldn't
And then,
buy it.
and then Shaul comes up with this thing, I'm not going to replicate it, humanistic values, cognitive skepticism, and diasporism. If I got more on this right. And I'm just looking at my good friend Yonah there, and I'm recalling the Marxist notion that emerges in Animal Crackers when Roscoe W. Chandler, the philanthropist, is outed as A.B. the Fishman, A.B. Kabila. So my question, you'll see it all come together. So my question is, my question is, why is it, or how is it, I'm noticing that Israel partisan education often flies under the cover of Israel education, and the right-wing guys say, we're just creating attachment to Israel.
Yes.
We're just doing, and the left-wing guys say, we're just doing education. We're opening up various possibilities. But really, if you look at who's doing what, who's really, there's really, the lefties are all about skepticism and openness and meeting different people, and the righties are all about, getting in touch with the land and so forth and so on. So I'm wondering, why is it that we all have to pretend to be Roscoe W. Chandler? Why do we have to become doing Israel education
Roscoe
when really
Chandler?
what's going on is
Groucho Marx.
the left wing education, both of which is legitimate except for the right wing. Why is it that really left wing education masquerades as Israel education and right wing education masquerades as Israel education, when in fact there's a lot of politics that's going on, a lot of political motivation and consequences of one or the other form of education?
I find it very odd that you're talking about right-wing and left-wing education. If you're doing education, it would
Well,
take a...
I would say,
Thank
can I
you.
answer it? I mean, all education is inherently ideological. All education is ideological. I think what Shaul is articulating isn't.
Educator, so I object to that.
What?
Mathematics education.
Okay, no, even mathematics education.
Euclidean
But
or
that,
non?
I think Shaul is articulating an ideology of liberal education
Yeah.
as it applies to
Yeah.
educating American Jews about Israel.
Yeah.
So that, you're labeling left-wing education. You know, so I think one of the problems in Israel education that we've had classically for decades is an inability and even a reluctance to be out front, to name our ideologies. And I think that reluctance is based in fear, in part, of the political repercussions for that, and also fear of sort of outing yourself that that you have an agenda. And I mean, I think that there's the line between indoctrination and education when you're talking about ideologies is very tricky because you are educating towards a certain ideology. One might be a more open ideology and one might be a more closed or a narrower ideology. So how we do that is really challenging, and particularly, as Bethany noted, that we're not, as educators, we're not the only ones having input into where people are getting their information and where they're processing what all of the various inputs that they have. So I don't know if that's answering yours, but I think it's framing it in a way that helps us understand. In this, given our world of diversity, we cannot articulate an ideology, just in the same way we can't articulate an ideology of Jewish education. We can't articulate an ideology of Israel education. And in some ways, maybe that's, we had this myth, we are one, of this unanimity that we talked about this morning. That myth no longer exists. We are not a uniform community. And so that should allow for a greater diversity of approaches to Israel education than we once had. And I think that that's a good thing, though educators are not yet on board with that. I think we need a lot of work to bring the educators themselves into that conversation in a way that they can achieve that. So you in the back and then Bob.
Well, I just want to build on that.
Oh, you wanted to, do you also want to build on that?
It's really quick. There's been a lot of discussion about whether we're educating for learning about Israel or whether we're educating for an American Jewish identity. And I'm wondering if the actual educators play into that and who are the people who are actually doing the educating.
And Bob. Okay, Bob.
Could I pick up
Yeah.
on both?
Mm-hmm.
From a structural perspective, not structural and educational perspective, not an ideological perspective. Israel education is funded, organized, and curricularized by the American Jewish community. It's a Jewish activity. Because of the nature of the American Jewish community, the overwhelming majority of the young members, male and female, of the American Jewish community are going to have a very important educational experience that is in no way structured by the American Jewish community, and that's the college experience. No matter what the previous educational experience is, day schools, summer camps, afternoon school, it doesn't make it, whatever sociologist can give us the figures, but there is no subgroup on the American Jewish scene that sends its young people to college at the rate that the American Jewish community does, which means that the younger members of the community are going to be exposed at a very formative period of their lives to a completely non-partisan perspective on Israel. I'm going to suggest that alongside the ideological, there are kind of two educational philosophies operative here. One is you prepare young people for a challenge by building up their defenses to the maximal level possible. Get them caring for Israel in every conceivable way, and that's the best way to prepare them for what they're going to encounter on campus. The other alternative is don't wait until they encounter these challenges. Introduce the challenges in a more nuanced, a more probing, a more supportive way. And to a certain extent, what we're hearing in what is, I'm not disagreeing, what is certainly an ideological difference is also rooted in a difference of educational perspectives in preparation for the college years.
It's very smart, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it does come back to David Kaufman's question of how this all relates. I mean, I do completely agree with Bob that this huge sort of watering hole that is the university, where upwards of 90% of American Jewish kids go through the university, it is a place where why would we want them to be not critical about Israel when they're critical, you know, they're intellectually critical about everything else they're doing. That's what they're learning in school. And here we have this opportunity that's not owned by the Jewish community or by the State of Israel that also runs Israel Education, and it's a good thing. And in our faculty seminars, the range of creativity around how to bring Israel in such interesting ways in front of students and in front of ourselves, it was truly inspiring. I went to that thinking I was going to be a participant observer and uncover some bias of the Schustermans, you know, funding this. And in fact, I joined in right away, and it was really extraordinary, because it was the group of participants for sure was a tough group to sell on something, and they wouldn't be sold. They were employing their professional identities, work in their different, different disciplines to bring to bear all that they could on unpacking Israel, and it was truly fascinating. So I think
Okay.
our students are lucky if they can encounter that.
Yeah.
Let me respond to the question from the back. There are American educators and there are Israeli educators often, on the ground, both on these trips, and they don't necessarily have the same agendas. They don't have the same educational philosophies. They're not in it for the same thing. That is part of the complexity of the trips, and that's another place where there's wiggle room. There are different things that are happening even in the same program, because people are representing different countries and different viewpoints.
So your research, if I remember correctly, showed, I mean, that the participants can perceive, the guides that have an agenda, a more overt agenda, are less well received than guides who try to at least present a more neutral approach. So I think that that's a really important piece as well, that they are more savvy consumers. They know when they're being fed a line, and I think that that's an important.
Yeah, certainly. But the Israeli educators, for the most part, are not thinking about how they can affirm the American Jewish experience. If that's on anyone's radar screen, if it's coming from the American side.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'm Andy Sugarman. I'm a rabbi and an educator, and just want to thank the entire panel. That Doctors Kellner and Horowitz, your writing was assigned at the Davidson Graduate School of Jewish Education about identity formation, and Yona inherited an incredible program that I was privileged to help start in my third year of rabbinical school in Encounter, before it really had taken on the kind of role that it now plays. I now work as a fundraiser, and I want to share a very quick story about the challenges, not political, but structural perhaps, about the funding world as I perceived it in Major Gifts Fundraising, which is an anonymous foundation, was behind a grant this past year. It's still working for the folks who are, still employed in youth movement fundraising. I was among the bloodbath at United Synagogue a couple months ago. But this anonymous foundation proposed a challenge to the youth movements in North America. Only 3 of the movements who were eligible were receiving funding, because the grant was tied to increased numbers participating and increased monies raised to then be distributed as scholarships. Again, only 3 were in the end receiving any money. So my question to you is, whether it's humanistic and citizenship oriented or otherwise, who's behind the funding, and what's happening that you think is positive in light of the material that you shared today? Where's the money that's flowing in ways that are directed towards the kinds of Israel education that, that you've been presenting this afternoon.
Okay, let's take another couple questions before we answer that. Yeah, ma'am.
Can you
Yeah, we
speak
can't
up?
hear
We
you.
can't hear you.
This question's mostly for Shaul, but maybe also for Bethany. In your research of birthright trips, did you ever come across anyone who, was it intentional that there was so much autonomy with the curriculum for professional staff coming from North America and also for the Israeli Torah educators? And who do those people feel accountable to when they're sort of like deciding to interject their own voices or just sort of like where does the ideology come from, and is it intentional on the part of Talmud, broadly speaking?
Okay, yeah.
I have a naive question about encounters because I never heard about them. So I was trying to figure out during your presentation, who is the object and what is the purpose of, who are you educating? Basically, are you educating Arabs about Israel? Or is it kind of, for the Americans, kind of a trip to the zoo where they go, they see the crocodile, they say, oh, we now saw the crocodile, we know the crocodile is concerned, but crocodile does not stop being a crocodile when they leave. But they are kind of saying, oh, okay, we now know. So what is
Happy
it?
to
Who are
answer.
you educating?
All right, and one more, and then we'll.
So I was really struck by your description of these people coming on your trip and sort of in 36 hours sort of having this intense moment where their sort of sense of self erodes.
Not my
No,
description.
no.
Someone else's
Somebody-
description.
Yes, your description of their description.
Yes.
And that led me to think about deep cultural categories and how they're operating here.
Yeah.
Presumably, a lot of these people who are coming, because of the fact they're coming on your trip, have already been taught a more complicated narrative. But if a more complicated narrative seemingly, in many cases, erodes with, a first encounter with the other, is it that different, the more right-wing and the more complicated narrative, ultimately that different when we're thinking about, larger cultural categories, or sort of what's the deep cultural element, and this is for everybody, of of Israel education, and why is it so vulnerable?
Okay, so Bethany, want to start?
Sure. The story of the funding is an important story that we haven't investigated enough. It's also on my docket of something to do. I think it matters hugely. I have two thoughts about it, we could all look down the list of organizations, for instance, and see who was funding that. But since we've had a backdrop of the conversation of comparing America and American Jews to Israel, one of the interesting things to have in mind when we think about the funding is that in America we're a voluntary community and we've got these big funders, and there's no accountability to the rest of us about it. Whereas in Israel, the Israeli government, I'm not saying it's still a democracy and has the kind of, one presumes that it's got some kind of feedback loop. So I think, I'm just throwing that out there. I can't tell you exactly what it means that there's a lot more ability, of course, of big funders to throw their weight around. And since I just came from a major education conference, the AERA that was in Chicago, I learned one thing about funding of American education, where the U.S. government is very involved and they're big funders. The most interesting thing I learned, and that I felt was analogous to us, that would be useful, is that there are many foundations that say what they want and then they go make it happen. There are few foundations, one example is the W.T. Grant Foundation, is that they identify a problem and then see who will come up with solutions. So I thought if we could get a little more ability among our funders to say, we see a problem, we'd like to take proposals of what would be a solution, that's a different model than we see a problem, here's the solution, and then we're only funding that. And then it's very ideological and there's no ability to get some air into the system, whereas the other one says, hey, there's research about it to say there's a problem, and then what kinds of solutions would we find amenable? So that's one point. About Rebecca's question about autonomy, Shaul or others can speak more about the specific programmatic autonomy. The thing I think is interesting to put on the table here is that the Jewish Agency for Israel, Jaffe, has a program called Shinshinim that they've been doing for the past few years, where they've been putting, the whole philosophy has now moved from shlichut, of having people come and be advocates and emissaries for Israel in a sense of advocating for Israel and having a stance that represents Israel. They've now adopted, in some ways, this approach that's people to people, and they put like young people from Israel in communities. These are post-high school. They put them in, they've brought several hundred over the past, I don't know the numbers now, but in the first year they brought a couple of hundred to Toronto and to a few other places and embedded them in different places in the community. And the job, what was the person responsible for? They didn't have to represent anything but just be themselves and speak about their experience with their peers and, you know, do something with the community. But they didn't have a job to do. They didn't have to increase aliyah or, you know, make something happen. The idea was to make the encounter more possible here. And so I just throw that out as yet another model of bringing Israel and America, or Israelis and Americans together. Okay, I'm done.
So
I don't have a comment on Moshe's thing. My head was thinking about the other things.
Birthright does not actually operate the programs. It sets guidelines, and it essentially licenses to independent program organizers. So you know, there are requirements that all of the trip providers have to follow. You know, they all have to go for the Western Wall, for example. There's certain specific places they have to go. So there's a degree of uniformity in the curriculum in that way. But each of the providers, you know, within that broad framework, is able to tailor the program to their own particular interests. And then you have the guides. You have a guide that's usually from the sponsoring organization coming from the States, and then you have a guide from Israel. All the Israeli guides are state trained and state licensed, so you get a degree of uniformity in that sense. The state licensing process is not so much about how to be an educator, but simply knowledge about the sites.
Although now the birthright,
changed
they
that?
have a birthright, the government program now has a special birthright track that is very focused on education. I did
Okay,
go
great.
and
So that's
interview
new.
them and
That's new.
watch
Okay,
that.
that's new to me.
It's a change.
Okay.
It began a year and a half
Oh,
ago.
great. Okay.
And it's really much more about becoming an educator, but also being a guide.
Okay, good. And then
working on it.
Yeah, and then the American guides they're responsible to their organization. They're responsible to the people on the bus, and and guides also have their own. They also have their own interests, and in some ways they feel responsible to those too.
I guess I should have prefaced this by saying I've staffed several birthright trips, and so I know all of that stuff. I'm wondering if Taglit, when this was being conceived of, decided we're going to let all of these different organizers, different ideologies, come at this in their own way,
Yeah.
and if that was intentional.
I don't know, but what I know about those conversations would lead me to believe that they were more interested in the organizational dimension than in the ideological dimension, and they did not. Remember, this is this. That's later, right? There was no J Street at the time, but yeah.
Since I was there,
Please.
Okay, well,
organizing these large numbers of college-age kids was decided to be beyond the capacity after Kim Jong, who
The head of birthright at the time, yeah. Taglit.
decided that they were not going to have a major organization to run the whole thing, that was impossible. And they were going to contract it out. So you're quite correct that the original thought was organizational, that it would be impossible to manage successfully this large thing. So they set up an education committee which specified the guidelines, and each organization that actually ran the trips thought that they had actually written the guidelines. It's very odd as to who was responsible. In fact, the guidelines look very similar. You did the history of this. They look very similar to those that have existed for 20 years. So it's part of the context of Israel and Israel trips is what they started with. And what the whole pattern of our discussion today has been that things have changed. And how they've changed and how they're reacting to it is actually quite complicated. There have been guides who have advocated very strongly a particular position. The Taglit organization has field workers, let's call them spies, who track what, as you know, who track what goes on at different sites. And I think 2 guys have been fired for being overly ideological. In this case, right-wing, as it turns out. But the mifgash, the encounter is insidious, because where are you going to get people organized of the same age as the American college students? In the beginning, they tried to get older high school students. It was very hard to organize. They also had to speak English to some extent. In the end, they settled on the Army as the people who had control and organizational abilities over the same age group. And guess what? So you get a military mifgash. It's unavoidable.
It's avoidable if you go beyond the Jewish community or if you go beyond the secular community. So there's a broader population in that age range, but the program has made a decision that the type of Israelis that they want to engage in, that have the mifgash in, do not include the ultra-Orthodox and don't include Arab citizens of Israel.
And a dissertation that's now in process. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Delivering people, again, it's organization, delivering people at the right time,
Absolutely.
at the right place.
Okay. I want to, yeah, thanks. I want to give Yona a chance to respond, and then I think we're going to come to a close. So.
I won't say very much because I think I talked a little bit about who we take, which is pretty much American Jewish elites, and the idea is to give them an opportunity to engage with Palestinians directly. I'm happy to say more about that after. Unmediated. Yes. Moshe, to your question, I just think it's certainly not my description, because I would say that people come off the trips with many different reactions. I think there can be confirmation bias. Someone can come on thinking one thing, and the trip reinforces it for them, whether they're on the left or the right. What I think is interesting is that not just the anonymous person I spoke of, there's many of the faculty and heads of the Jewish institutions in Israel who are sites for American Jewish communal future leaders, where they spend time. There is a deep anxiety amongst them that they don't know how to help continue to facilitate a connection that perhaps once upon a time was much easier for them, and that they are struggling. And so the encounter experience becomes, in my opinion, a convenient scapegoat. But it's not just encounter. I hear their anxiety. They don't know how to present the conflict in a way that could be kind of complex and satisfying. But it's not just the conflict. You have gay and lesbian students studying to be rabbis in a host country that perhaps is not receptive to that perception of Judaism. And so that's another opportunity where they're deeply anxious. How do they help form an attachment for these future American Jewish communal leaders? And Encounter happens to be one in a string of many things in which they're expressing that anxiety about.
All right. So I think I hope this panel was fruitful. One thing that came clear, sort of reinforced for me, the need that we have a lot more questions than answers in Jewish education around Israel. A lot of need for further research. Many of us at this table are interested in doing that research. And
So
thank
the
you.
funders here should.
Yeah, if you know any funders, and funding not to their agenda, but to an open agenda, really around inquiring as to the substance and content of how we teach Israel. So thank you all. Thank you, our panelists.
Very good, thank you.
There's coffee in the lobby, and we resume at 3:30. Promptly at 3:30.
I got myself in trouble on tape talking about a dean. What?